My name is Carolyn Kuby, and when my husband passed away about 2 years ago, my 4 children and I decided we were going to keep this place going. Because it meant so much to him. He loved this place. It really, became something that he just really spent a lot of time thinking about and being concerned about. So I welcome all of you here tonight. Thank you for coming. You have a wonderful program here tonight. And are there people on Zoom?
There are people on the Zoom.
Oh, and welcome to the people that are on Zoom. Okay, enjoy.
Next up, we have John Mulrooney here to introduce Forrest Gander.
Thank you very much, Carl. Thanks for being here. I'm going to be brief. I should probably remove the whole thing. We're here to celebrate this book, Twice Alive, subtitled An Ecology of Intimacies. And if ecology is already concerned with intimacies, that of organisms to one another, then here we are confronted with an even further dimension of intimacy, how elements already involved or engaged in intimacy on their own realm connect with, mirror, sometimes dissolve into other forms engaged in their own. How the intimacy of lichens, which will quietly dominate this book, and our lace stoles around an oak, and the intimacy of a couple walking in the mountains that sees no gap in the pleasures nestled in his eyes watching, her eyes watching, and the intimacies of language and our linguistic forebears, as when the poet hikes seemingly alone with the cabin of Kenneth Rexroth as his destination, are all interrelated. We mostly know Forrest's many accolades, the Pulitzer Prize, not that one, for this one in 2019. The many collaborations and translations. I think I first became aware of his work as a translator of Honey Science. And the films, there's some very interesting films that accompany this book on his website, which I think I encourage you all to check out. Chancellorship of the Academy, the Guggenheim and Rockefeller. That list is so long that we sometimes forget he was trained as a geologist. And because that's down the column. And there's something about the kind of attention required to this, maybe an intimate attention for a geologist that's always present in the work. In an interview with Zach Finch, you do a kinship to your work in this volume to what Miles Davis calls listening into, which I'm looking forward to doing tonight. And elsewhere in that interview, you speak of an approach that dissolves the presumed membrane that keeps us from recognizing the way we extend beyond what we call ourselves. To do that, we need, in the words Forrest writes in the second sagomentristic series from this book, cindered utterances in a tongue from which everything trivial had been volatilized. Everything trivial to fire. Please welcome Forrest.
This is a book I recommend. I wish I'd been here for her reading last week. Sandra Lenz, a terrific poet. Yeah. Thanks for coming. This is the most intimate group of people that I may have ever read to. And I thought I'd start tonight with a poem that's written by a Russian poet named Alexandra Eremenko. It's a poem of national and self-disgust, and it was published many years ago in Agni and resurrected on Agni's blog this month. I co-translated it 20 years ago with Sarah Dickinson. And now it takes on a sad, iterated relevance. So my thanks to William Pierce and to the editors at Agni. On the removal of troops from Afghanistan. 9th year of war in Afghanistan, and I thought, I'm fed up with my silence. No one will curse me now for writing about it. More likely, they'll publish me here and over there, all sing my praise, except those in chain gangs who took the rap for speaking out first. Both Yazov and Gromyko will know what I'm saying, all right, not immediately, but that's their problem. And Sakharov and Baikov will see with me eye to eye, Vasily Turkin and those backstreet heroes, and certainly Nazhib Bula will get it right off the bat. Well, maybe Prokhanov will miss the point, and well, maybe Rosenbaum and Babrak Karmal, that twerpy Borovik, but any Afghan guerrilla would gladly give me his medal. At last, the nightmarish starvations have ended, and we can drink vodka again. Even those highbrow Lithuanian girls give us Russians their seats on the tram. Trash the military insignias, brother pacifists. The tanks are rolling home from the war. And inside our country, we're in dire need of a few specialists, some skilled mechanics. So Russia was there for 10 years. We were there for twice as long. 241,000 people at least were killed in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some 71,000 of them civilians. Debe ser un malentendido. It must be a misunderstanding, is the title of the most recent book by Coral Bracho, one of Mexico's most signal and influential poets. She writes in this book, which I read and was so personally moved by, with non-judgmental affection and compassionate watchfulness of her mother's last years with Alzheimer's. My mother also suffered from Alzheimer's, and I also wrote poems about it, but my poems were full of grief, and she somehow manages to write about her mother's Alzheimer's with such tenderness, such attentiveness, and some humor that we really get to know this person who's disappearing. This translation will come out next year from New Directions, as it must be a misunderstanding. I'll read just a couple poems from this. Observaciones. Las piezas de rompecabezas se pierden, pero no la mirada, que lo sabe suyo. Las formas, los objetos se funden, se desmoronan, pero el sentido del conjunto persiste, entre momentos, entre ficciones, bajo fracturas incesantes, como un umbral, un asidero. Observations. The puzzle pieces get lost, but not the look she knows to be hers. The forms, the objects, they merge, they crumble, but a feeling for the ensemble remains. Between moments, between fictions, despite constant fractures, like a threshold, a handle. Observations. That bird, dropping down to peck the asphalt, so close to her foot, is something she's never encountered before. There's nothing to compare it with, nothing that links it to that cat, nothing it shares with that bush. They're all unanticipated tenants, convincing presences in a space that for the moment we share with them. There aren't kingdoms that harbor them or separate them out into their particular territories. No words that link them together. This thing here, fluttering its wings now, and hopping between the grass and the dust, it has no likeness. And the rest of the poems I'll be reading are from this book, Twice Alive. And the book starts with an author's note, which seems well, it seems worthwhile to actually read before I read some of the poems. So I'll read this little note to you. Author's note. What many of us learned in high school about lichen, that it's an indicator species for pollution, for instance, and litmus, in fact, is derived from lichen, and that it's the synergistic alliance of a fungus and an algae or a cyanobacteria is pretty much true, but simplified. Lichen ecology seems to have more to do with collaboration than competition, and collaboration is transformative. With lichen, which may be, some scientists say, more related to animals than plants, the original organisms are completely changed, utterly changed in their compact. They can't ever return to what they were beforehand. And according to Anne Pringle, one of the leading contemporary mycologists with whom I had the lucky opportunity to collaborate, it may be that lichen do not, given sufficient nutrients, age. She and some other contemporary biologists are saying that our sense of the inevitability of death may be determined by our mammalian orientation. Perhaps some forms of life have theoretical immortality. The thought of two things that merge, mutually altering each other, two things that intermingled and interactive become one thing that does not age, brings me to think of the nature of intimacy. Isn't it often in our most intimate relations that we come to realize that our identity and all identity is combinatory? Twice alive. Mycobiont, just beginning to enwrap photobiont, each to become something else, its own life and a contested mutuality. Twice alive. Aldol cells, swaddled in clusters. You take a three-lens jeweler's loupe to inspect the holdfast of the umbilicate lichen, then the rock tripe lichen, then the irenic amanita mushroom swarming with a kind of mite that has no anus, then the delicious chanterelles called trumpets of death. Supreme parsimony in drought lets lichen live on sporadic events of dew and fog, a velvety tomentum, and a wet thallus. I crush oak moss between finger and thumb for its sweet perfume persistent on your skin when I touch your throat, so slow to evaporate the memory of seeing sunburst lichen on the sandstone cliff. But if herbivores eat wolf lichen, they die, and if carnivores eat it, they die writhing in pain, with the exception of mice. It is rarely possible to tell if lichen is dead or alive. The fuzz of fecal dust from lichenivorous mites triggers woodcutter's eczema, the bane of loggers knee-deep in sweet fern, sawing down cedar. So evening finds us at this wood's edge, where, at a dead oak's base, shoestring rot glimmers, its luminescent rhizomes reflected from the eyes of a foraging raccoon that doesn't yet sense us. Air ghostly and damp clings as we step from our woods to look across the field toward the first lane of lit houses, their dull pewter auras restrained by wet haze. Cordyceps, the brown of your eyes, softened with rain and remotely fluorescent, dissolve into slime after a few days. Whatever we thought we were following was following us, its intention unlinked to our own. So that sequence, that's a third of the sequence. It's sort of divided through the book, but it's the only of that sequence that I'll read, the title sequence. The book actually starts with a poem called Obeyed, which I'll read now. You know, Obeyed is a dawn poem. This is for my mother and for all the others that we've lost during the pandemic. Obeyed. Can you hear dawn edging close? Hear soft light with its vacuum fingertips gripping the bedroom wall? An understated what? Exhilaration? Can you hear the voices, if they can be called voices, of toadies scratching in the garden? And then the creaky, low, husky voice, flecked with sleep beside you in bed, telling a dream slowly, as though in real time. And now, interrupting that dream, can you make out the voice, if it can be called a voice of absence, speaking intimately to you, directly, using the names of those who are vulnerable, those who are gone? I know you must hear it feelingly, a low vibration in your bones, for don't you find yourself absorbed in a next moment, beyond your given life? Most of the next poems that I'll read are part of a sequence called Sangam Acoustics, and they're based on a poetry that appeared in India between about 300 BCE and 2,000 years ago. There was this flourishing of literature in Tamil Nadu in southern India that came to be called Sangam, which is convergence or coming together. One of the two styles of that poetry is called Akam, and it's a poetry in which it was considered not only unethical, but really impossible to write about personal emotions without writing about the landscape with which your emotions were involved, because the landscape, what's around us, influences us. In such a way that human feeling is inseparable from the place where the feeling takes place. A.K. Ramunujan is the scholar who translated and reintroduced a lot of this poetry, which might be considered a kind of proto-eco-poetry, a phenomenological poetry in which human subjectivity merges with the world, with landscape. Because California, where I live, shares the same 5 basic landscapes that appear in the Sangam poems. I've written poems influenced by the Sangam tradition, but relocated to California. It seems to me that all of us live in an unprecedented, exigent time, that what we've done to our planet, geological time and human time, have come closer together than ever before in human history. And that one of the things that we have to acknowledge if we're going to remain here with other creatures is that we live in a mutuality with them, and that sense that we are, that our relations with the rest of the world are transactional only, have been devastating for us. So I moved to California, and the first year I was there, the wildfires came through and burned the town next to me. 2 years later, the same thing happened. All of those people became refugees in my town. That town was Santa Rosa, and this poem. So the 5 landscapes I'll be talking about, one of them is Wasteland. I do understand that somebody else wrote a poem called Wasteland. I'm sure it won't last. This is Wasteland for Santa Rosa. Green spring grass on the hills had cured by June, and by July, gone woolly and brown, it crackled underfoot, desiccated, while within the clamor of live oaks, an infestation of tiny larvae clung to the underleaves, feeding between veins. Their frass, that fine dandruff of excrement and boring dust, tinkled as it dropped onto dead leaves below the limbs. You could hear it 20 feet away, tinkling. Across the valley, on Sugarloaf Ridge, the full moon showed up, like a girl doing cartwheels. No one goes on living the life that isn't there. Below a vast column of smoke, heat, flame, and wind, I rose, swaying and tottering on my erratic vortex, extemporizing my own extreme weather, sucking up acres of scorched topsoil and spinning it outward in a burning sleet of filth and embers that catapulted me forward with my mouth open in every direction at once. So I came for you, turning the present into purgatory, because I need to turn everything to tragedy before I can see it, because it must be leavened with remorse for the feeling to rise. And this poem, which is called Post-Fire Forest, I wrote after I was doing research with a biologist who's also a poet. Her name is Maya Khosla, and she goes into post-burn areas. Because in California, as in other places in the US, the timber industry is really in bed with the Forest Service. So when a fire goes through, the Forest Service just gives the land to the timber industry, which comes in and clear cuts everything, the dead trees, the living trees, and then they burn the rest in fires that are much hotter than wildfires and kill all of the mycelium that will keep anything, so that nothing will grow there for years and years. And then if they plant at all, of course, they plant a monocot forest. Whereas, if we left it alone, the forest recovers very quickly. And so her job is to go in and see how quickly she can establish that other species are moving into this habitat, so it shouldn't be clear-cut. And one of the first species that moves into a post-burn forest in California is a black-backed woodpecker. So that's what we were looking for. And it was a period when I was feeling, I was having a very hard time about grief for my wife's death, but I was involved with someone else who was accompanying me, who was really joyful and full of life, Ashwini Bhat, who's my partner now. And I didn't know how to process that joy of hers. Post-fire forest. Shadows of shadows without canopy, phalanxes of carbonized trunks and snags, their inner momentum shorted out. They surround us in early morning like plutonic pillars, like mute clairvoyants leading a sursum corda, like the excrescence of some long slaughter. All that moves is mist lifting, too indistinct to be called ghostly, from scorched filamental layers of rain-moistened earth. What remains of the forest takes place in the exclamatory mode. Cindered utterances in a tongue from which everything trivial has been volatilized, everything trivial to fire. In a notch between near hills, stubbled with black paroxysm, we spot a familiar sun, liquid glass globe at the blowpipe's tip. If this landscape is dreaming, it must dream itself awake. You have, everyone notes, a rare talent for happiness. I wonder how to value that walking through wreckage. On the second day, a black-backed woodpecker answers your call, but we search until twilight without finding it. One of the most independent towns in the United States, so independent that a number of you I know will have heard of it, is Bolinas, California, which was also a haven of poets. Robert Creeley up there in the beautiful Elsa Dorfman photograph, and wrote Trout Fishing in America. Richard Rodigan was there. Jim Carroll was there. He wrote the Basketball Diaries there. Joanna Tolstoy and Kiger lived there. Tons of poets have lived there. And in fact, Michael Ondaatje wrote a lot of Cat's Cradles while he was in Bolinas. Well, yeah, you can read about it. They've consistently, since the 60s, hacked the sign that says Bolinas that the State Department keeps putting on the road so that nobody can find their way there. And people have GPS and get there now. It's also a famous surfing spot. In fact, another poet, Stephen Radcliffe, famous poet surfer, lives there. This is called Sea, which is another of the Sangam landscapes. Sea, night surfing in Bolinas. Maybe enough light to score a wave, reflecting moonlight, sand reflecting moonlight, and you spotting from shore. What you see only as silhouette against detonating bands of blue-white effervescence, when the crown of the falling swell explodes upward as the underwave blows through it. A flash of visibility, quickly snuffed by night, the surf fizzling and churning, remitting itself to darkness with a violent stertor in competition with no other sounds. Paddling through dicey backwash, the break zone of waist-high northwest swell, as into a wall of obsidian, indistinguishable from night sky, diving under, paddling fast, and before I sit, one arm over my board, I duck and listen a moment underwater to the alien soundscape, not daytime's clicks and whines of ship engines and sonar, but a low-spectrum hum, the acoustic signature of fish, squid, crustaceans rising en masse to feed at the surface. I feel an eerie peacefulness veined with fear. After 20 minutes, the eyes adjust behind a hand dragging through water bioluminescent trails. Not enough light to spot boils or flaws in the nearing waves appear larger, closing in fast. Then 5 short strokes into a dimensionless peeler, 2 S-shaped turns that kick out, and from shore, your shout. It is cowardice that turns my eyes from the now empty beach. For with you, I became aware of an exceptional chance. I don't believe in objective description, only this mess, experience, the perceived world, sometimes shared, in which life doesn't endure, only the void endures. But your vitality stirred it, leaving trails of excitation. I've risen from the bottom of myself to find I exist in you, exist in me, and against odds I've known even rapture, rare event, which calls for but one witness. And this is another of this sea poems. And thinking also about immigration, that we're living in a period of the most massive human migration in human history. And also thinking of the ocean as a constant immigrant, always arriving at the shore. And now I'm living with an immigrant also in the United States. Immigrant sea. Aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him, watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him, so familiar and foreign? The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts thrash crests of swell. Spring grasses twirl circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged, even grass positive, pollen negative, So when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself. Will there be any water hiding there? Thank you, Jane. To you. This poem's a little bit of a joke, a geology joke, an erotic geology joke, sort of modeled on Robert Johnson's Terraplane and so on. So this is the Sangam landscape, the mountains. This is in the mountains, Placer County. Whose blunt finger, its hornblende nail clipped, circles so lightly across the crevice now, and her green delight of serpentine laughter as their tram swoops over the trunk valley. Car door slammed behind her, she faces the cirque in denim cutoffs, risen to her pudenda, and sees no gap in the pleasures nestled in his eyes watching, her eyes watching. Above the mission of his face, they swing like church bells, for mass always sways outward. A taste of jaggery and warm pennies, oh no, in a wet score grooved by glacial erratics. Where, he asks, as she initiates the uplift, and when did you learn to do that? Decamping down slowly. A rattler riding its coil, her torso on her hips. She leaves chatter marks on a succession of moraines. Dark-paired suns. The orioles dilate as suction eddies whirligig along the melt stream. When the supplicant slowly bends, long thighs separate along the joint plane. No undertow of doubt, every part willing. The forest encroaches ashen earth when her knees begin to jerk. I have a lot of questions from the Spanish translator of this poem. And I think I'll finish with this poem, which is 433 pages long. No, it takes about 2 minutes to read. This is called Unto Ourselves. Even when we realized we'd stopped, in every essential way stopped, moving forward. When we came to see we were descending, even more tightly bound to the vortex, as images rushed by in front of us and a blue whale rotted on the sand in Bolinas, its stink drifting southward, where dozens of barnacled 40-foot grays, dead from starvation, began to hulk against the shore, the white-tufted foreheads of waves smashing against those knolls of oily, decomposing flesh. It was everywhere we looked, if we cared to look, out over the bite-sized squares of cheese and Saintsbury wine, into the hum taking place under a coved moon, or cared to listen to clumped wild rye shushing the dunes, while pulverized rock shrieked along fault lines in decibels so muted only the soles of our feet, conducting the ground sound up into our tali, could register what was happening. Right there, where our lives have been, cut off from themselves and become something else, drained of substance, steeped in the privilege against which we protested, with those we called our friends, the ones who lately seemed to contract backward from our greetings, giving us to suspect that they too sensed something askew, the skip at the center of ourselves, or just an inkling of abyssal unhappiness was it, concentrated into the early evenings, like one of those spectral white deer introduced to the headlands that began to outcompete native species, and so, before they were slaughtered, every one, by hired hunters, inciting arguments about what was native, if all systems are given to change. Maybe our ear twitches, maybe the deer's ear twitches, but we still can't quite make out in the dimness what we're looking at, can we? Nor is there interim from the tumult of incoming, the masticating chores, ping-pings begging immediate response, the sheer overabundance of the present shame, which plugs up each minute and stands in now for whatever it meant to live oneself, before every gesture became performance for an audience we imagined never to be finished with looking at us. And as for the budding out of being we'd called passion, or the sensual moments phrased into our gait when we were coming to feel something, when our shadows merged, not as romance, but real consequence of our mutuality, with shadows of conifers along the steep ravine, and completely naked and without relief, the world parsed us into the inhuman, where roseate lichen surged across rocks, lacking nothing that might be needed to answer for our existence. By now, some of us, outmaneuvered by the economy, were lying around Dolores Park like fallen fruit waiting to rot. Others found themselves receptive to a trivial, self-justifying kindness. What with coral belching up its algae, the constellations receding, the awakened tundra, how could we bear, we wondered, to each other, even the weight of our own sorry initiatives? Life, someone countered, is pure gratuitous magnitude. Just look, the light is there, grace itself. But it was already noon, and as we looked, the colors of the hills began to blanch, and all around us in the field of the visible, we sensed, without speaking, duration's ebb. Thank you so much.
Forrest, would you be willing to answer 2 or 3 questions from the audience?
If they can make up 2 or 3 questions,
Does anyone have any
I'll
questions?
try.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I had to interview a poet recently for a magazine.
Torture.
And it was good. It was a meandering conversation. And he basically said, you know, there was a moment for him where he was like, oh, that's how I want to write. Has there been a moment like that for you? Does it change? And like, what
Yeah.
kind of pushed you to that point?
Well, certainly in the beginning, you know, there's Mike Perot. I wanted to write like him. My friend, we were sort of learning poetry together. He had a voice really early on that was mysterious and haunting and lyric. And, you know, I think like lots of poets, I remember in grad school being called out for trying to write too much like James Wright. And then Frank Stanford had a big hold on me, and so there've been a lot of poets, or a lot of moments where I've wanted to write like other poets. Thomas Merton says, you know, that so many monks try to be another monk, and that it takes a long time to figure out how to be yourself. I'm still learning that, and also it's really important to me not to just repeat myself. That it's a real. And we look around at lots of poets that we know, and we look for the ones who, as they age, keep pushing it, and don't just repeat their successes. Not having had many successes, it's easy to. Yeah. So is that sort of an answer?
Yeah, I think so. Was there like any moment that like it clicked for you? And it doesn't have to be like writers, right? It could be like maybe the like geology portion of your work, right? Where you're like, I want to integrate this more, things like that.
So I came to live with CD, and we left the country and went to Mexico to live, and that's where I wrote. I wrote this poem that she recognized was like my first good poem, and so it was a real signal moment. I was really sick in Mexico. I don't have a spleen and lymph nodes, and had colitis, and out of that sickness, like Neil Young's Down by the River, I wrote the first good poem, and I figured out why it was different from the other poems. Mm.
Why was it different from the other poems?
I think because I hadn't gone in thinking about the kind of poem that I would write, and so what came were it's a poem in Rush to the Lake. It's the poem. It's the title poem of Rush to the Lake. And it was sort of a synthesis of things that had just happened to me, that I hadn't quite processed, and it was that aliveness, that lack of planning, that helped make that happen. And it's funny, now I can't write that way anymore. Now my writing really comes from I can't just sit down and improvise a poem. It really comes from lots of reading and lots of note-taking and then a gradual assemblage of that sort of stuff. How about you?
How I write poems?
Yeah.
I average about a poem every 4 years. But the rawness, the poems that are really good typically are those every 4 years there's something that happens that I can't quite process.
Yeah.
And so then I stop and I write it down, and in writing it down I understand it, and then I have a poem too.
That's the beautiful thing about language, is that we do articulate our experience and are able to offer our world to others with this language thing. They say that the three things that every culture ever studied have had are human cultures. That we make some kind of laws, some kind of inhibition against incest in a culture, and every human culture treats the dead in some kind of special way. We don't just like walk over them. We formalize a way of dealing with the dead. And every culture has had poetry, some form of it, often connected with shamanism or healing, visionary experience. But it's really integral to human beings. And it's interesting to me now, the Academy of American Poets has been sharing this big poll that was taken. And right now, the number of Americans reading poetry has shot up logarithmically in the last 10 years. And the majority of the new interest in poetry is among young people and people of color. And I think that in a culture, our culture now, which is so based on spectacle and image and the reduction of language into Twitter feeds, and which is interesting too, and I know interesting poets making poetry from Twitter feeds, so I'm not dissing that, but there is a reduction of the of our vocabulary, of our lexicon, of our language for the nuances of our experience. And I think people need that, and that's what is driving them back to poetry. Yeah.
I love Anne Pringle's work so much.
Oh, you know her?
Yes,
Yes.
she's amazing. And I'd love to hear just more about your collaborations with scientists.
Yeah.
I feel like so many poets try to do this, and then it's, I imagine it has to be incredibly generative, but also challenging, so I just love to hear about your experiences with that.
Yeah. So I have a degree in geology, and I've been interested in science all my life, and geology helped train me sort of to see sort of with geology you have to look at large scale features like mountain and be able to see uplifted faults, things like that. But then you also have to look at the microscopic level to see the shear zone in the faults and crystal, what's happening to them. So you're constantly jogging back and forth between large scale and small scale, and I think that has come to be an aspect of my work. And Anne Pringle, who taught at Harvard for a while and unfairly was not given tenure, is a star, and they should eat their hearts out. We have her now. And studies mushrooms all over the country in California. And she teaches at Wisconsin. And I was invited by a literary critic, a really wonderful literary critic named Lynn Keller, whose focus has mainly been on sort of experimental women. And her last book is called Ecopoetics in the Self-Conscious Anthropocene. And she invited me to, and a Native American artist, and a scientist, and Pringle was a scientist, to meet at a secret place, which even now I can't tell you where the place is, except it's somewhere on Lake Huron. But evidently, at the beginning of the century, of the 20th century, 50 of the wealthiest families in America were worried that all their wealth was based on industry and cutting down forests, and they were going to lose their hunting grounds. So they merged together and bought this big tract of secret land, and kept it as this private land. And they asked Aldo Leopold, who was an early ecologist, how to caretake the land. And they actually followed his directions, so that now it's the most pristine forest in the United States, and the state that it's in has finally forced the people to, in exchange for some tax, reduction, to allow scientists to come there. So people go and study, squirrels and trees and fungi and everything. So that's where I was with this artist and the scientist, and the scientist took us around. I spent my childhood in the woods, and was pretty good with trees and animals and reptiles especially. But I did not see, I was never paying attention to mushrooms. And when suddenly I had someone to point them out, they were everywhere, everywhere. And of course, what we see in the mushroom is just what they call the fruiting body. It's really, most of it's invisible to us and underground. And I was fascinated with that, and then also fascinated with lichen. And it turned out that even the most signal lichen biologists, they don't know much about what it is. They're not even agreed on whether it's kind of animal-like or whether it's a plant. It's this strange collaboration, and it seemed like a sort of model for how we might need to be in the world, realizing that it's a collaborative enterprise, and not just one involving one species. Which I like about us, like behind Jane's knee and under Mike Perot's armpit, there are millions of bacteria and other creatures that live on them constantly. And in our guts, there are parasites constantly that are part of our digestive system, and DNA from other creatures, including parasites, long ago became incorporated into our own DNA. So the idea that, when I lived in Arkansas and saw Ku Klux Klan information, Ku Klux Klan flyers, it's all about racial purity. But as with most ideas about purity, it's a complete myth. We're not pure, even as a species, much less as a race, which is a made-up word made up by racists. There's no biological determination of what makes race. And the acknowledgement that we are composed of others and that we're involved with others at the start, which is sort of anti-Christian in some way. I mean, Christianity's changed, but sort of the authority of Christianity, and I think, was about us being different from everyone. There are things with souls, and there are things that can't be redeemed, that don't have souls. And that division characterized a way of dealing with the rest of the world that we need to change. In like short time, you guys need to change. One last question. Anybody know about Sangam? Had heard about Sangam before? No? So it's this A.K. Ramunajan is a great translator for these poems, really interesting. Another translator in the room is Nydia Hernandez. And she's a big presence sort of connecting Latin American writers and North American writers. Good person to get to know.
New book coming out from Aerosmith Press next year, right? Yeah.
Ah, great.
Let's give Forrest another round of applause.